Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Public Sector Summit. Nick, I'll be your room host for today, and this is our last session for today. So, a couple of housekeeping things. Please silence electronics, your phones. The emergency exits are marked by the exit signs on the side of the building, and the bathrooms are across the hall past escalators on that side. All right. Now, without further ado, let me introduce your panel to talk about advancing IT modernization in the government.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Microphone on, maybe? How about now?
And you're getting some thumbs up.
Okay, yeah. I'm getting thumbs up, or actually raise my voice. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So we just learned that we're the last panel before happy hour. The good news is that we've got some very interesting speakers today on the panel from various parts of the world. I'm Shannon Kellogg, and I run our public policy and government affairs for Amazon Web Services in the Americas. And I've been with Amazon about 7 years, and have had an opportunity actually to work with some of these gentlemen already in their particular countries or areas of expertise on IT modernization and various reforms over the years as organizations, including states, including countries, including other countries, move forward with IT transformation initiatives. So it's an honor to be here today with these folks, as well as with all of you, to talk about what I think is one of the really interesting and important topics when you think about what governments are trying to do and what organizations are trying to do to serve citizens better and to transform the way that they do business. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I've asked them to really begin the session to talk about what IT modernization means to them and their particular role. We're really lucky in that we have to my left Representative Jim Nash from the great state of Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota, so I have to say the great state of Minnesota because it is a fantastic place. But Representative Nash is one of these reformers in government who's been working a long time to try to move forward with IT modernization in his state, and so we're going to hear about that. Next, we have Dan Boulay, who's the Chief Information Officer of the Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development in Canada. I have to confess that I've been working in Canada long enough that I still think of his ministry as Industry Canada, which it used to be named. But we've had the opportunity to work with he and his colleagues over the years, including some of his colleagues who are in the front row here, including Anita, today on IT modernization efforts and their transformation within their agency and across the Canadian government. It's a very interesting story, multi-year story of how they've started to move to the cloud and modernize their systems across the Canadian federal government. And then last but not least, I'd like to introduce Liam Maxwell, who is, like myself and some other colleagues in the room, an Amazonian now, working for AWS in a new global role as director of our digital government transformation efforts, which is very appropriate for Liam because the first time I met him and started working with him, he was the chief technology officer of the UK, where he led some amazing transformations within the government and across the public sector in the UK, and now is taking many of those lessons learned in his new role at Amazon, working with these gentlemen as well as many others in the room. And so let me start with Jim, and you just talk a little bit about what IT modernization means to you and some of the efforts in Minnesota.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Shannon, and thank you for being here. I'm pleased to be with you today. My name is Jim Nash. I'm a state representative in the House in Minnesota. And Minnesota, we don't all talk like the movie Fargo, so just get over that now. But so my role as a state representative is first the guy that helps create the funds to buy technology. It's either hardware and software, or as we're hoping to do, become more cloud compliant. And that role has come through several other elected offices. I started off as a city councilman and then mayor of a city in Waconia, Minnesota, where I live, and then as a state representative in it. What I've seen along each way is that smaller units of government, state, local, county, townships, really are very much behind the curve. And when I got elected to the State House, I made it sort of my mission as somebody who has worked in the technology industry for the last 13 years to bring that experience and help colleagues who, as in any citizen legislature, as we have in the 50 states, most of them are citizen legislatures. You've got farmers, you've got doctors, you've got lawyers, but very few IT people, and I think a lot of that's because most IT people don't like to go and hang out with other people. So it's awfully tough to get elected when you just want to live in a dark room wearing a black concert t-shirt and eat bacon and drink Diet Mountain Dew. But that message has been that proper IT and cloud can be an enabling device. And it really can be a tool that a state can use to become more competitive. And it can also be a tool that reduces cost. And we'll be talking about that over the course of this talk. But that's been my role at the House for the last number of years. And it's not as easy as you would think. So I know we'll be talking about some of the challenges, but that's been my drive. And I'm kind of a unicorn in the House of Minnesota because there's like 3 of us that work in technology out of 201 legislators. So it's been interesting.
Thank you, Jim. Dan?
Yeah, Dan Boulay, in Ottawa, but born and raised in Winnipeg, which is kind of northern Minnesota when you think about it.
It's almost Minnesota.
Yeah,
We'll take
almost,
it, yeah.
Due north of Moorhead. So I've been with the Canadian federal government since 2006. Prior to that, 10 years with one of your platinum sponsors here, it's a global management consulting firm. And the chief information officer now at the what used to be called Industry Canada. Just to paint a picture for what that is, we're all things business and industry really in Canada, mostly small and medium-sized enterprises. If you need to incorporate your business, that's through us. If you need to grow when you're looking for funding to grow your business, if you've got intellectual property that you want to protect, that's through us. If it doesn't work out in the end and you need to file for bankruptcy, we can help you with that. Or mergers and acquisitions, we'll regulate that area. So we are literally cradle to grave business in Canada. What really motivates me about IT modernization in government, though, is the opportunity, quite frankly. There is so much that we need to do and can do and will do, and we've started. It's funny, at the keynote this morning, there was this one slide with all these aging pieces of technology, and what did we have up there? COBOL and mainframe and green screen. We were checking all those boxes, literally, for not just my department, but if you look broadly across the federal government. So huge opportunity there, and thankfully, lots of changes, which I know we're going to get into in terms of reforms as we talk through this panel, that are really enabling that and making it real and able to demonstrate that government can keep up and really set a good trend in terms of modernizing IT and digital experiences for citizens.
Terrific. Thank you, Dan. Liam?
So I'm Liam Maxwell. As Shannon said, I've just been with Amazon 6 months. Prior to that, I was CTO in the UK. The team I'm leading at Amazon is AWS is to help governments transform, is help get through that transformation and become modern. And if you think what the things we're really helped us drive our modernization programs. It was the ability to change. It was the ability to build services which met the users and the citizens' needs was right at the heart of the reform, because that meant we were delivering services that worked for people, and that necessarily delivered fairly large cost savings of several £billion. But it was because we'd started to build and design around the citizen and be in a position to change. And that's why in 2013 we went cloud first, because that gave us the flexibility to move. The other side, in terms of modernization, which has really helped us change, is the ability to share with other governments, and that's why I'm really excited to be working with AWS, because governments don't compete. So, a government the government of Sweden is never going to open a driver license service in Canada because they don't need to. They've got a geographical monopoly. And that means the governments are in a position where they can start to share ideas and techniques and code and practices which can help everybody move faster. And that's the job I'm doing at Amazon, is helping identify that and help a group of governments move and accelerate towards modern technology.
Thank you, Liam. So starting with Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the reforms that you've been trying to move forward in Minnesota, including the legislation that you just spearheaded?
Well, let's start with the legislation that we just got done. Really is sort of the culmination of help of some of your colleagues and some local folks. But we were able to insert into a bill that we're going to be moving in the direction of what you are all calling cloud first, but it's a permissive language to enable that to become a reality. And it's a big deal to get the bureaucracy. And I'll be talking a lot about bureaucracy, I'm sure you all will. It's okay, you'll get over it. To get to the point where they're comfortable with what is viewed as a potentially disruptive decision for the overall organization. But prior to that, I work in the cybersecurity world, so cybersecurity is one of the things that I work in as well. But to get my colleagues and staff to the point where they're comfortable with these concepts is probably one of the biggest challenges I face. And in getting this piece of legislation passed, it really required lobbyists. I acted very much as a lobbyist. I'm proud to say I was thrown out of many of my colleagues' offices in pursuit of this. But modernizing IT, as I had said earlier, is an enabling thing for a state or a country. And when you recognize, as I do, when we appropriate money, it's money that's being taken out of the pockets of the people who were there to serve. So I see the vision long-term as we're going to ultimately save you money while delivering government services to a better level. And that balance is very difficult and tenuous at times when it's time to convince my colleagues or to convince commissioners that this is the right decision to make.
And in this particular case, the governor recently signed this bill, and how are people receiving that?
He signed it just a couple of weeks ago, about a week and a half ago. And I think that overall people are generally on board with it. I think that you'll hear some chatter from people who like to sell iron. They want to put servers on the floor somewhere, and that's the argument that we've been making is the CapEx and the OpEx and the future spends all go away. And that is a case that we actually have hard numbers that we can point to in other states and other countries. And that's the thing that we have to do. And I'll say this a number of times, but in a partisan government like we have here in the U.S., you have two sides of the aisle, and ones and zeros subscribe to neither of those philosophies. So I say that there isn't a Republican 1 or 0 and a Democrat 1 or 0. And that's what we're trying to get at the state of Minnesota, is to understand that it's not a partisan issue, that it's just good government. And that's what we're trying to get done.
Yeah, totally agree. And I do want to come back to this shift from OpEx to CapEx too. But Dan, in Canada, it was interesting, about 6 or 7 years ago, Canada pushed out this shared service initiative, which had data center consolidation as sort of a central part of it. And then it moved to the Canadian right cloud strategy at the federal level, and now you have a cloud first policy. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that journey, where your department fits in, and some of the particular reforms that have been, made a real difference for you?
Yeah, it's certainly, it's been a long journey. It hasn't been easy. When shared services started actually back in 2011, there were a couple of key elements to that mandate, but the central one that everyone thinks back to and points to is this data center consolidation concept, bringing literally hundreds of data centers consolidated into a very short few, a half a dozen or so. We're not there, and the original plan was to be there by about 2020. So we've fallen short of expectations from that perspective, but over the course of that time, there's been a lot of evolution in terms of what's available from a data center hosting perspective. Obviously, with the right cloud and what became a cloud-first strategy, that really opens things up for departments such as ours. It's a game changer, really, because in the past, what we would have to do is convince people with a business case that what we needed to do was go to cloud. Now it's actually flipped. So now what we have to do is consider cloud as the very first option, and we'll have full support to getting that through our governance, getting the approvals that we need. And if we have very strong reasons why it doesn't make sense, then it's incumbent on us to actually make a business case for on-prem. So it totally flipped it, and that's why I say it's a game changer. And that coming into play, together with a number of contracting vehicles that actually allows us to make this happen. And again, we're not fully there yet. We've started. We've got some unclassified contract cloud procurement options right now. We'll be rolling some more out over the course of this year that'll make it a little bit more attractive, a little bit more widespread in terms of adoption. But underpinning all of that, I would say in recent years, has been also a shift in mindset. And I would qualify that around digital and really making sure that everything that we do takes into consideration the end user, has them at the center of the design, and that we do things, it's a buzzword, but in an agile way, iterate, quickly experiment, and you can't do that with the current or the past traditional methods. So knowing that you have partners who can help you stand these things up quickly in the cloud and demonstrate progress, conduct proofs of concept quickly, fail fast, like they say, and learn from it is really the blessing, is really what's causing us to really move forward nowadays. And we didn't see that over the course of the last few years. It's really been in the recent year or months with those contracting options available that we can bring in that external help, because we haven't done this before.
Yeah.
We need that help.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I do want to come back to a couple of those points. So we've heard, Liam, already, we've heard about some of the reforms that are necessary and the bipartisan nature of that. We've heard some of the cultural resistance. We've heard the importance, and I'm sure there are some nodding heads out here about how you have to have the right procurement and acquisition vehicles in place. So in the UK, you did this over a number of years in stages. What are some of the lessons learned there on these issues, but also other things, including that shift from OpEx or CapEx to OpEx that you'd like to throw out there?
So I think one of the things, just to frame the story of how we made the move, is the program we launched called the G Cloud, which, just for clarity, wasn't a cloud, it was a framework, it was a procurement framework. But what it did was it enabled government buyers to buy from a wide range of innovative suppliers. And the real thing there was we started to turn the procurement question on its head. The problem wasn't making it easier for government to buy things. The problem was that we had made it massively difficult for small businesses and innovative businesses to sell to government. And so the thing that we did as a change was to make it easier for small businesses to sell to government so that they could get onto the procurements, which would then mean that we could then access their innovation. And so we had to remove lots and lots of what we used to call shouty crackers, regulations. Things like you can only do a £200,000 contract if you've got a turnover of 200 million. Or you could only join something if you were on a procurement framework for 5 years, and by the end of the 5 years, the technology would have disappeared. It would have come, gone, and disappeared in that process. So you had to be able to help people start buying things on a shortened time frame. We always said the maximum was 2 years, and that you could start to buy small components of software programs and development programs instead of buying the whole stack from one big integrator. And that turned the whole thing on its head. And where we used to have a big integrator that would be the route to small businesses, we now have lots of small businesses that are running on secure, industry standard cloud platforms. But those small businesses can do business really effectively. And about £4 billion of spending on that, approximately 50% of that is now with small, medium enterprises. So the growth there and the growth in our supply chain and the growth in jobs all the way around the UK was tremendous, but that was because we started to buy from and use a procurement framework which was much more permissive and much more open. And that really was the way that it started, because then once you had people that would sell the services on the cloud, then the departments would start saying, oh, well, I need to go and buy cloud services to do this. And the demand and supply match was quite difficult to get going. It took about 18 months, but once it was going, it really started to work.
Yeah, and I think that's a really excellent point about how migration to cloud does enable you to have faster access and greater access to small businesses and emerging technologies. You and some other leaders that we've worked with over the years have talked about how shift to commercial cloud is democratization of IT, and that's essentially what you're talking about there. I'm going to go to the audience in a couple of minutes, but let me come back like a dog with a bone here to this issue around the shift from CapEx to OpEx. Because I think that's, a lot of members of the audience are dealing with that in their respective roles. Can you talk, each of you, a little bit about the lessons learned? Maybe starting at your end, Liam, and we'll just go right down the line.
So the shift to operational expense, once you start, we introduced something called spend controls, which enabled us to see how much the total cost over life of an IT program would be. And because of that, it really identified that if you started to build in an operational and build around OpEx, one, you knew how much you were going to spend, and you knew actually that it was probably going to decrease over time as you used the OpEx approach. But two, it meant that you didn't have those big balloon expenditures which the CapEx brought in, which were always difficult to manage, always ended up with more money spent on them, always ended up with costing more money as time went through. Whereas with an operational expenditure, you knew when you did the business case that your prediction was going to be much closer. And what that did in treasury terms is it reduced what was called optimization bias, which meant that the treasury that we went to would have much more confidence that your business case would meet the numbers it would meet. So as you're in that game of that skill of getting money from a treasury, OpEx actually really helps you win the trust and win the ability to help your services be built, because you've got that predictability, which you just don't get with a capital expenditure plan, especially over, say, a 7-year period, where traditionally you would have had to go and buy one set of CapEx and then another set of CapEx halfway through, and you hadn't quite finished with it by the end, etc. It's just much smoother, much more effective to do it that way.
Dan?
I'm taking notes, actually. This is great, because we're actually in early days ourselves. So I haven't necessarily lived it to the extent that you have, Liam. It's funny because most people think of government as super conservative, focused on the funding, and we absolutely are. The reality is, though, at the point that we're at today, I'm making a case in selling the migration to cloud not on the basis of CapEx or OpEx as much as what the benefits are from an agility perspective, being able to take control, deliver things more quickly. That's what the business clients that I have in the department expect. They expect quicker turnarounds. They understand that it comes with a shift in the costing. We talk through that, but we spend probably 90% of our discussions on what it means from an outcome agility perspective versus from the funding perspective. Not to say that that necessarily will be easy down the road. We're still expected to come up with business cases and forecasts of our expenditures. But the switch from CapEx to OpEx at this point is not, it's not the biggest question that I'm getting. It's expected, understood, and people just want to see it happen. Fortunately, that's the mindset that I'm against. So it's an exciting opportunity for us right now.
Jim, what about you in Minnesota as you're in there lobbying your colleagues, some of whom are appropriators, no doubt? How do you get sort of that different mindset going?
So to give it some context, in late 2006, the state of Minnesota had roughly 73 different IT shops. So each agency had their own CIO, and they had their own data centers, and there was a bill that created the new Minnesota IT that we now call Minute. And they said, okay, consolidate everything down to an ideal data center number of 6 and go. And the mindset that has perpetuated at Minute is data center, because that's all we understand. And I call it the cult of the blinky light. And I think we all are very familiar with the cult of the blinky light, because if you can't see it or open up a door and say, hey, look, there it is, they're blinking, we're all good. That's the problem that I'm having in getting people to understand that you can remove that capital expense by putting things into the cloud. And it's very nebulous, because you have to describe something that you can't go visit. Legislators often will get in a bus and we'll go take a tour somewhere where, we're fixing this bridge, we're building this. You don't get to go to the cloud, and you can't open up a door and see all the blinky lights, but you can go to a data center and walk around, and they like that. that's comfort for them. They, ooh, I'm buying this thing. Well, this thing is going to be obsolete in pick a number of years that you choose for your depreciation schedule. That's the problem, is that they only understand this one thing, so they're sort of primed to come up with that several millions and millions of dollars. And you know, I've been on the Appropriations Committee. I've been vice chair of the Appropriations Committee for state government, and we see millions and millions and millions of dollars. So to me, I see an option out there that can remove that, and we just pay by the drink, and it's scalable. And we talked about that this morning in the keynote. Is that if you need to ramp up, great, then ramp it down. That's a very alien thought, and for those of you in state government, you understand, and you're probably nodding, and I see that some of you are.
I think some federal colleagues might
Yeah.
be as well.
But the problem is that they don't understand something that they can't walk up and lay their hand on. And that's the culture that we have to get to, and it's extremely difficult. And as I said before, remember that in many state governments, you've got elected officials who have never done this thing. So we have a good number of farmers from Minnesota. We've got some lawyers. We've got teachers. We have people who are in business, but they don't deal with this. And what I'm trying to get them to understand, and I talk about this in my professional life, is that this is not an IT issue necessarily. It's a business issue.
Yep.
This is how do you deliver services to your residents of the state better, faster, cheaper, more securely, because this is inherently more secure. And I try to help them understand, too, that not only are we talking about CapEx for the iron on the floor with the blinky lights, but we're also appropriating millions of dollars for cybersecurity, which we'll still have to do in part, but with cloud, you're eliminating many of those strains on the pocketbook. Yep. And when you look at the cost of government and the budget for the state of Minnesota, it's ballooned $10 billion in the last 10 years. It's only going to continue to go up as we become more connected electronically. And this is another thing that we need to get into the mindset of Minnesotans. And we've had some fairly glaring failures in our IT shop. We had a driver's license and license plate software that only took 11 years to build and only $120 million and failed on day one. So it's now becoming more difficult to advocate for wholesale change because there's such a bad taste in the mouth of anybody in the legislature as it relates to Minute. So that we got this bill passed was fantastic, but now we have to go back to this next year's session and hold people's trembling hand and say, this is going to be okay. And you can get rid of a lot of these problems because not only do you have the lack of the need to invest money in iron on the floor per se, but you also have people who can help you implement and get up and running, whereas with just the bureaucracy, it's only those people and they're all singing off the same sheet music, whereas with a cloud mentality, they're going to have people who are from around the world all saying, hey, this is something that you should consider. I really appreciated what you said about governments not competing with one another, and we compete with Wisconsin just because, well, that's a whole other thing, but
Packers, Vikings.
correct. Yeah. But that's really where I would like to get is...
Well, there are 49 other state governments implemented the driving license service.
Well, and that was my point for many years was I tried to do the build, buy debate with them, and they want to build things because, oh, this is us. This is Minnesota. We know better than everybody, and on most things we do. But not when it comes to making software, and not when it comes to buying more iron to put on the floor, because it's a battle you're never going to win.
And in terms of risk, the risk of building new products, etc., it's so much more effective to
staggering.
find something where you're not going to be out of if you're buying something in CapEx and you're, I mean, even when I did a startup in 2000, and fully half the £4 million we raised went on hardware. Yeah. It was so risky to do.
But you guys are not alone on this journey. I mean, I see some nodding heads here. I mean, this is a common, set of resistance points, when you're trying to make some of these transformations and disrupt sort of the old way of thinking, is people do like to try to hold on to their boxes and their big piece of metal, and they like to see the blinky lights, and they like to keep their particular, part of the budget. And sometimes you have folks, that are very eager to try to keep the government jobs that they have in place versus retraining them and repurposing them. I do want to get to that topic too, but there's some really good, I think, collective wisdom here to share on how you're able to move forward despite some of these points of resistance. But I do want to get ready also with a microphone here in the audience. Do we have a microphone? Yes, we do. And I am known to randomly call on people too if I don't get a question or two. So do we have any questions right now in the audience? We got a couple of gentlemen right down here. If we could have you introduce yourself with the mic and yeah.
So Mike right here, Peter Whitcroft. I'm a systems manager at Federal IT here. So you mentioned, Liam, with OpEx that helps with estimation, reduces uncertainty in a budget as opposed to CapEx where you have those refreshes every 5 years, whatever it is. For the cloud side, how have you guys reduced or improved your ability to estimate what the costs will be, especially subscriptions and use and all those things?
So I think that's, given the broad estate we've got, we didn't have a central methodology for doing that estimation. We did undertake, and the way that we worked out how we were going to spend and future spend was by using a process of spend control to help identify what we were going to do. Beyond that, at that stage, one of the most important tools we brought in was spend transparency. So spend transparency. So transparency within government is really, really helpful if you're running a reform because you can see how much things cost. And in principle, how much you spend on the IT is a component of this, but actually how much does the service cost? And so one of the things we brought in a performance platform which enabled us to show the cost for each transaction. And that showed, how much were you spending on delivering the service and how much, how many people use the service every year. And that allowed us to identify the cost that was there. We also measured the digitization, the digital uptake, the customer satisfaction, all of those components. And what that led us to be able to do was to be able to say, look, the customer take-up of this is very low and it's still costing us a lot of money. Let's reduce the amount of money that each transaction costs by making the service work for the people that are using them. And that then takes you to the idea of, well, how then do you find whether somebody is actually completing the transaction online? Lots of government services we inherited had people starting the transaction online and then finishing up by ringing a call center, which was doubly wrong. This allows, that transparency mechanism allows you to spot where those savings can be made and tune the service to make it work. And in fact, it's one of the, we made an open source version. It's one of the things that I'm bringing back in my role within AWS as a performance platform for governments to help them identify these trends, identify the costs, and then see how they can make the changes happen.
Well, and doesn't that kind of transparency also, Jim, really help you at the policymaker level, to really change the game here? I mean, we've seen this in many states and many countries where you look at that sheet of what the cost really is because there are transparency requirements to disclose what the cost really is. It really moves the needle, right?
It does, because in the state of Minnesota, our minute is a chargeback agency. So to follow the money, it's very, very difficult because the Department of Health may be charging back this much, but the Driver's License Bureau is charging back this much. And in an appropriations committee, all you really want to know is what are we spending? Mm-hmm. And that's like trying to understand the most mysterious thing out there, more mysterious than what happens in the Senate. It's really difficult to nail that down. But if you can get the cost transparency and you can avoid many of these costs for CapEx, and you can say, look, this is the only method that we're doing this on, it's going to drive the level of transparency. Because I hear, not just from bureaucrats, I hear from the people, not only in my district, but because I've sort of been involved in a very high-profile IT screw-up as one of the people who's leading reform, I hear from all over the state. And people are saying, look, the cost is too much. Yeah. And you have to respect the fact, and I do this frequently in committee, I'll take the wallet out of my pocket and I'll thump it up on the desk and say, this is where the money that we're spending is coming from. You have to respect the taxpayer's wallet. And because of that, it drives us to doing things like cloud, because you just don't say, well, we have to spend $10 million because the refresh calendar says we have to go buy new things.
But once you've spent the capex, the effect that you can have on your operational expenditure in the future is nothing, because you've got that massive, huge capex spend at the beginning, which you have no agency as an official. You've got no agency over at all. So your reforms are completely, you've got this huge weight pulling you down of the original capex, whereas OPEX allows you to make those changes and actually gives your colleagues the incentives to make the changes.
Yeah, the situation in Canada is actually a little different. We have a version of Minute in Canada, and
I hope it works better.
It has its challenges for sure. It's getting better. So I, as a line department CIO, I'm actually one step removed from those blinky lights, and so I see that the migration or the change over to cloud is bringing extra transparency, bringing more certainty, in addition to the agility and those things that I was talking about before, and that's, I think, something that we've been lacking with the model that we have right now for centralized IT infrastructure provisioning, and partners like AWS and the services that are delivered, and the way that we can actually track and monitor is going to blow everything out of the water from what we've been experiencing and living before. So that transparency is critical, and is going to actually allow, once we get a couple successes along the way, I think allow a real snowball, to use a Canadian term, get us really, really moving down that ski hill fast.
Or an AWS term, too.
Well, to that point, I think it's interesting to also understand where some of the pushback is in this desired move from CapEx to OpEx. I was accused of this in the state of Minnesota of trying to cut the X out of government, because what would happen as a result of greater cloud utilization is, in their opinion, a removal of those employees. And when they showed the graphic earlier today, it seemed to have resonated with all of us. But we had like 30 COBOL programmers, and they've been there for forever, and they cost a lot of money. And the perspective at the state of Minnesota was that these are long-time valuable employees that we have to hold on to at all costs, and that the only natural end to Representative Nash's bill is that you're going to fire all these people. Well, some of these people might just retire, or they might get retrained, but the pushback on the movement to the cloud has been, oh, I'm just going to say it, you're cutting the hell out of government. I was accused of that on the floor. Well, that's not the case. We're trying to make government better, and if some people are no longer there as a result of attrition or whatever, from my perspective, that's a conversation that's worth having. And Liam, you had said,
Or they could be retrained as well,
absolutely,
which is certainly a part of the conversation.
Liam taught me a new idiom that turkeys don't vote for Christmas. That the people at the state of Minnesota are somewhat protectionist of their colleagues that they view as their property in many ways, that we have to protect these jobs. Well, I make the converse argument that we have to protect the wallet of the taxpayer. And I think that the wallet of the taxpayer should have a greater voice at the table.
Protect the wallet of the taxpayer, but also enable and equip workers who want to transform themselves and do other things within government.
Absolutely.
On the tech side, because there's lots of opportunities to do that retraining.
So many of the people that we had when we started our reforms they joined government IT because they wanted to work in what we call mission IT. That's the interesting bit that looks after when you're building services and dealing with users and actually designing and putting things together and building the services at work. And so many of them felt trapped working on common services and just keeping the lights going, which they didn't, if they designed it differently, they didn't need to be doing. And so the freedom to work in those interesting areas was the thing that everybody actually helped drive the willingness to reform.
So we have another question here, and
Yes,
we'll
my name
take
is
probably one more in the back after this gentleman.
Julius Williams of GSA Federal Government. This is for Jim. Do you find out now that it goes back to Liam when he said change, and changing in our government system? We're 9 years into cloud first. Okay, 9 years. Do you feel that working with AWS can get you past, or get us past that people, business problem that we have with automation? And how do you feel about that?
Well, considering we just had the bill signed, we've got no empirical thing to point to at the state of Minnesota, but we have been working with AWS a little bit. I think that that's a great first step, and that we're going to see what you just mentioned, that it's going to escalate change. It's going to allow us to provide better services faster, more securely, and the cultural change, I think, will happen. I think that, again, it's a very protectionist state. So it's a very heavily unionized state, and that's some of the first line defenses. Oh, we have to protect these people. I think that when we see long term that the reforms will come as a result of cloud adoption, I think that we're going to see many of those people want to be retrained because now they're excited again. Because I've spoken to some of the Minute employees, and they're not having any fun. They're the blinky light monitor, and they hate their job. But because they've been in their job for 15, 20 years, there's really nothing else that they view as a viable option. So no one's hiring for COBOL programmers, right? So they hold on to that. So if we can move in this direction, I think what we're going to see is a more invigorated workforce at the state. We're going to see a higher level of productivity. We're going to see new and innovative things that no one's even thought about coming out. And I think that's what excites me.
Thank you. We've got one more question back here, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead.
Mark Foreman from Unisys.
Hey, Mark.
Could you discuss the balance between infrastructure as service, taking out cost and improving security versus the modernization and applications and data as a service and using that for transformation? Where was your preference? Where do you see the greater benefit for your communities?
Anyone want to start with that?
Well, I'd say from my personal perspective, I would definitely position software as a service as kind of the de facto first choice. In our case, as we modernize, it doesn't mean that infrastructure as a service, and we're experimenting with containerization and bringing things in as is to start. But if you're going to modernize properly, you got to take advantage of the modern tool sets. And to say that I'm just going to lift and shift as is onto a cloud platform without making any changes, taking advantage of new processes, new ways of working, meeting the expectations of the end users, which are much higher now than they've ever been, taking advantage of what those software as a service offerings have is your best start, is your best way to get started quickly and deliver quickly.
Liam, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things I would think about in that space is really as you prioritize what you should do within your organization and where you should make how you choose your resources. We use a tool called value chain mapping or Wardley mapping to help us identify where in the value chain the various components of technology sit. And it's really clear to us that successful organizations are the ones that leverage and can leverage common technology services that are common, that they can buy on an hourly or a variable rate to provide the common core services that they need, and then to actually specialize and focus on the things which differentiate their business and help them have agency to deliver change within their organization. And so, yes, interestingly, the software as a service is usually the play that people use to try and standardize the common technology services that they have, which means that they can get that. And then the focus is where you differentiate the service. And that's that's usually very expensive per unit cost. It's where you need to use agile techniques to help it move. But that's a really, really important separation between the two things. And we found that to be really, really helpful in the way that we designed modern departments.
Thank you. Looks like we have time for just one other quick question if we have an eager member of the audience. There's a gentleman right here.
Hi, Robert Dupree with TELUS Corporation. Representative Nash, it sounds like what you have is a case study for other states and for the federal government. Mike, I'm curious, did you encounter the most difficulty with your colleagues, which is going to be replicated in every state, 97% are not IT professionals, understanding the benefits, or were they just simply trying to understand the complexity of the cost, and they could not overcome that for a while? What was your strategy to try to deal with that imbalance in knowledge, literally? Because we have that in every state.
That's an excellent question. I think some of it is the complexity of the issue. And that's bicameral, so when I would go over and talk to the Senate, I would speak slower and use flashcards. Sorry. But it is a lot, the content. But then it's also just the overwhelming, the breadth of what it does. You know, so many of them understand very, very small amounts of what technology can do, and there's no vision that's cast for them. So as they were throwing me out of their office when I would bring these things up, it was a lot of times just because, well, one, they were tired of me, but two, they just didn't understand the issue. And sometimes there's not enough time in the legislative day to sit down for a long, in-depth conversation. But what I ultimately wound up doing was, because of just sheer inculcation, gaining their trust to get them to the point where they could say, you know what, Nash is right, which is almost never said, but I'm going to listen because the constancy has been there. And as you talk to people from different states or even at the federal level, I think you're going to see the same thing because, you know, federal lawmakers, while a full-time legislature, they all come from different backgrounds, and some of them are IT professionals, but not many. And I think it's very difficult to make the case to somebody who maybe they're interested in agriculture or maybe they're interested in commerce, getting them to understand this thing that some of them can barely spell IT. And you have to get them to the point where they want to grasp it because they now recognize that it is the great enabling device that we have to both make ourselves competitive on the global market, but as a state, around the state, to be an attractant to businesses that want to locate there. That's the big challenge, and that's been the thing that I've been working on since I got there. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Well, that's a great way to end. It's been a really informative session here. I would just like to thank our panel members for participating and, quite frankly, for your leadership. You know, I mean, these are real leaders, and so please join me in thanking them for this session. And thank all of you for attending. Have a great happy hour and rest of your evening.